Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people's land, Ngunnawal and Ngambri people whose lands I am on, and lands and country across Australia. And I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge that the country we all meet on, whether it's virtually or physically, was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As migrant and refugee women particularly, we are beneficiaries of settler colonialism and systems built on dispossession of the First Nations people. Thank you for joining us. I'll start by a brief introduction of the Harmony Alliance for those of you who are new and haven't joined us before. The Harmony Alliance is one of the 6 national women's alliances representing voices of migrant and refugee women at the national level. We are a membership-based organization and have close to 150 members at the moment, which includes organizational and individual members. And you're also welcome to apply for the membership if you're interested in being a part of the Harmony Alliance. You can find the application forms and criteria to be a member of the Alliance on our website. I am Sana Ashraf. I am Senior Policy Officer at the Harmony Alliance. And today I'm going to stand in for Maria Dimopoulos, the Chair of Harmony Alliance, who had a family emergency at the last moment and won't be able to make it to chair the session. So yeah, I'm just standing in her place today, and I'll facilitate and moderate the session. This is the second webinar in our intersectionality discussion series. I see a lot of people who are joining today also attended the first webinar, which was 2 weeks ago, so we're doing it fortnightly. But there are, again, a lot of new people, so I'll give a brief overview of what the discussion series is about, and then we'll talk more about today's webinar. So this series of discussions came out of our long-standing and commitment and long-time work on the topic of intersectionality more broadly, and also with the specific aim of embedding intersectionality in our work as Harmony Alliance, and creating guidance and guidelines for wider policy and practice sectors in Australia as well. Today's webinar is the second in the series. The first was focusing on our position of privilege and relative privilege in the context of the stolen lands that we live on and call home. So for us, intersectionality came to living in Australia, it became really important to start any conversation about intersectionality by acknowledging that we are beneficiaries of and we are part of the settler colonial system here. So today's webinar is having set the scene and having acknowledged our position more broadly. Today's webinar is focusing on intersections of multiple forms of systemic discrimination against migrant and refugee women more specifically. So the specific systemic discrimination that we are looking at today is racism, sexism, ableism, and homophobia, and how they intersect in shaping the experiences and lives of migrant and refugee women in Australia. We have a wonderful panel today, and I would really like to thank everyone on the panel for taking out the time and committing to the cause and joining us today. I'll provide a brief introduction of all the panelists, but I'm sure they will introduce themselves and offer more of what their expertise is and what they're working on in their own talking points. So I would like to start by introducing Dr. Judy Tang, who is a commissioner at the Victorian Multicultural Commission and the president of the Australian LGBTIQ Multicultural Council. Judy is also a clinical neuropsychologist and is the convener of the APS Psychology and Cultures interest group, and the Psychology and Aging interest group as well. Her passions lie in advocacy for mental health, LGBTIQ, aging, and cultural diversity and equality. She was awarded Globe's LGBTI Person of the Year in 2019 and was awarded a VMC Multicultural Champion in 2018. Nyadol Nyuon is an Australian lawyer and human rights advocate who was born in a refugee camp in Ethiopia of a family fleeing the Second Sudanese Civil War. She works as a commercial litigator in Melbourne and is a regular media commentator and winner of many awards. And Nyadol has an amazing, has a wonderful public profile and presence, which all of you would be aware of, and she doesn't need much introduction in that space. Dr. Ruth De Souza is a Vice Chancellor's Fellow at RMIT University, based in the School of Art and Design and Creative Practice Enabling Capability Platform. She is a nurse, academic, and community engaged researcher in gender, race, health, and digital technologies. Ruth is also honorary senior research fellow at the Center for Digital Transformation of Health and at the University of Melbourne. She has written some amazing pieces on her blog about intersectionality lately as well. So I would really recommend going and reading her work on this topic more broadly. Dr. Shakir Hassan is the fourth panelist, and she is the author of From Victims to Suspects, Muslim Women Since 9/11, and a contributor to the anthology and Me Too Stories from the Australian Movement. She's a research fellow at the University of Melbourne and received the 2019 Brenda Gabe Leadership Award from Women with Disabilities Victoria. So now, having introduced the panelists and before moving on to the discussion and the really important questions that we want to discuss and cover today, I would like to acknowledge that any conversation about racism against migrant and refugee women in Australia is relative, because racism we experience cannot be in any way equated to racism against the Indigenous peoples in Australia. I would also like to acknowledge and address the fact that we do not have a First Nations person on the panel, but we have had these conversations in the background with them, and the message that we have been getting is that they want us to acknowledge our position of relative privilege without burdening them with having to explain racism against them in our spaces or in our conversations every time. It is exhausting for them, and they they have much more important work to do, and we acknowledge and respect that. So with that respect, we also respect that acknowledge that our experiences of racism should not be and cannot be conflated with the historical and systemic racism against Aboriginal owners of lands in Australia. On that note, I will turn to our panel and start today's discussion. And just a housekeeping note for the question, for any questions that arise during the discussion, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll get to the questions. We'll have plenty of time for questions in the end, so we'll get to them soon. And now, turning to the panel, I would really like to start by asking a very basic but extremely important question that I was saying to them earlier is still misunderstood, and there is a lot of work, a lot of understanding required on that. It is unfortunate that we still have to talk about these issues, but it is important. So the question that I would like to start with is, what does discrimination and violence against women look like when it is driven by a combination of racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination? Can I ask Judy Tang to start the discussion? Thank you, Judy.
Oh, thanks, Anna. And I did sort of mention to everyone to feel free to pipe in so we can make this move more of a conversation. And I'm happy to sort of bounce, views and experiences and information with each other as well. So feel free to ask questions and contribute as we go along. But thank you very much to to the Alliance to having me here today and having these wonderful people. The question itself, for me, it depends on the setting, I suppose, and I know everyone knows this as well. I feel like that when there's the additional isms that come on top of it, it compounds the experience, it compounds that violence, it compounds that discrimination, whether it be in some ways where, a person, it might start off with discrimination where you can start bouncing off, and it creates a negative loop, a negative cycle on top of that. On the other hand, what it can also do is to start creating layers of inequality and barriers on top of the existing barriers that are there. So, for example, if we talk about, just sexism to begin with, but then when you add a layer of racism on top of that, then now they've got like two barriers, for example, to overcome. And it doesn't necessarily mean 1 + 1 is 2. It could be a 1 + 1 is 10, for that matter, in terms of accessing services or having a chair at the table, as they say. So for me, that's depending on the setting, that's how discrimination and violence against women could look like, and does look like, when it's driven by a combination of all these things on top of that.
Thank you, Judy. That's a very really concise and really well articulated explainer of the very basic concepts that we're trying to grasp. Can I ask Nyadol, you to please weigh in on what you think about this, and you can add to what Judy has already said as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think obviously there is different types of violence that we're all aware of. So there's kind of the verbal violence, and then there's physical violence, and then maybe microaggressions, and that's a side issue. But I'll try and illustrate my points through examples of how the differences that an individual bring, whether difference of race or gender or sexuality or able body, kind of layer up. So there is a research that was done by Amnesty International about the presence of women online. And so this is now, I'm speaking now in relation of say verbal abuse. And it shows that the group that, that women generally, despite their political leaning, receive a significant amount of abuse online than say men. And then it went further on and say that the people that experience most of abuse, about 80% of the abuse online, were predominantly Black women. And that was quite targeted abuse. So when we talk about, say, for example, women use of platforms like social media platforms, and say, for example, Twitter as one space, you notice that I know a lot of women of color whose views are really interesting and amazing, and they are in positions of power that have decided not to use that platform at all because of the consequences of constantly having to engage with racist abuse. Because it's not the fact that they're just women who can be problematic if you're a woman with an opinion. It's also the fact that they're different looking women. And so their occupation of that space that all of us share becomes really complicated by that additional layer of being a person of color. And then of course, if you experience certain forms of disabilities, then social media itself might not even be accessible in the first place. If you have visual impairment or hearing impairment, and it's not built in a way that kind of caters for those needs or doesn't take them into account, then it means that that platform itself, in terms of looking at the example of our intersects, is that you would have probably no or limited access to that space. In terms of, let's look at how that then occurs in terms of just physical violence, for example. We know that as women, that women experience a significant amount of the domestic abuse that occur. We're losing two women a week in Australia due to domestic abuse. And we know that COVID-19 itself has made those situations worse, and that abuse within home is likely to occur at much significant rate. But then because of the way in which COVID-19 has been racialized, it also means that if you, for example, again, seeing the intersectionality, that as a woman, you might not even be safe at home, but you might also not be safe outside the home if you happen to be a woman of color who's from in an Asian background or Asian looking, or in fact, the way it has progressed more recently to say South Sudanese and Muslim women. And we've seen that where where things intersect again, where Muslim women wearing scarf are not safe in public spaces because they're a visible example of people that can be targeted. So intersectionality, in a way, it sounds big as a theoretical concept, But if you look at the kind of day-to-day examples and the experiences in people's life, it's quite obvious. Until I had children, I did not know how the whole world around me was built for an able body. You know, and I remember I could turn up to a train station and just run up the stairs without a second thought about how would somebody use this space if they didn't have a body that has been catered for as my able body had been. And when I had children, and that's just a small experience of it, I remember being stuck in train station because I didn't know where the lifts were. I didn't know where they, you know, and all of a sudden I realized something that used to take me a second, all of a sudden now has become a way of thinking and strategizing what I'm going to do and all this. But I had assumed that the world, you know, was fair. I had assumed that you could, you know, go to restaurants and walk in because I'd never tried to fit a pram through the door of a restaurant, or to find out that most restaurants don't have sufficient space for sitting with two kids, or, you know, all these little things that I was able to do because I was able-bodied and I was, you know, at that time a single person, became quite a very different experience. So sometimes the ability not to see the intersections of discrimination does come just from our own assumption as human beings, thinking that how we experience the world is how other people experience the world too.
Thank you. That's really the crux of it. And we have been wanting examples, and that's what people have been asking for, and to give those examples from lived life and how it impacts in your everyday life, and what are the assumptions that we make, even as we go about as migrant and refugee women of color. We are still making a lot of assumptions about things that we are not subject to, things that we may not be experiencing as underprivileged or disadvantaged. And that's where the understanding of intersectionality becomes really important, because you could be a part of a group where you are traditionally not the privileged group, but still there are certain things you're taking for granted because you're not looking at the experiences of everyone else. And with that, I would, can I please ask you, Shakira, to share what you think about this, and would you be able to share some examples and some more of your experiences to add to the conversation?
Yes, I'm interested to hear that reflection on. I'm not on mute anymore. You can hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Given that I've been this week, the Royal Commission into Abuse, Discrimination of People with Disabilities has been hearing this about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on people with disabilities, and there's some extremely predictable but nonetheless disturbing testimony from disabled women at those hearings. I have a visible disability myself. I have multiple sclerosis. I acknowledge that that's a very different experience of other disabled women, extremely predictable but no difference. I have a visible of the COVID-19 identity there, extremely disabilities that they've had that identity their whole life, had to deal with this stuff. But anyway, to swing back, yeah, that reflection on access, physical access, and on the online space too. It was validating for me in a way to hear these other women thoughts that I've been having since the outset of the pandemic, which was partly, well, all this working from home, all these Zoom meetings, all these provisions that were made because of the pandemic, they were measures that disabled people have been campaigning for years and were told was too much hassle, worked very well, and now all of a sudden they're in place. So and we're going about fucking time, excuse me. But on the other hand, we have sisters all over. Everybody will say, well, we tried that. It was a mega hassle. And we don't, you know, we'll keep it a bit because it makes the overheads a bit cheaper. But on the whole, it's just things were being done before. But talking this, so on the one hand, she's largely, you know, housebound. All of a sudden, she can participate because there's well, just so much more entertainment and anything else online, so much more But at the same time, she had been going physically out at least sometimes, and now she's worried that being completely invisible, seeing disabled people out and about and in the workplace, people will forget about their little disabilities and feel like you stand out way too much. And to bring that into how, it was validating for me in a way to hear this other identity, the sex or other forms. Initially, early on, disabled people were very far ahead of the curve in realizing how much danger the pandemic could face, because many of us are immunocompromised as well, are high risk, even as other women and men who told the Intersectional Commission we won't survive, many of us, when we get that virus, where, provisions that were maybe called yes, and we're told was too isolating for that fucking time, excuse the language. When we tried that, it was a mega hassle, and it's a bit cheaper, but on the whole, let's just go back to the ways, because there's just so much happening for her. But at the same time, she had the but on the other hand, we have quasi-accidental, mostly guys who just veer out of their way to, we'll keep it big, we've got the disability identity, intersex, when she up against how much danger the pandemic meal and breathe or cough or entertainment apart from anything else. And women, as other women and many of us, where we get that virus. But at the same time, she had a mandated isolation about it in the workplace, and we'll feel like you stand out way too how it intersects how the disabilities of other forms. Like initially, the exact background might be who'd had much more aggressive harassment. And so I asked, and other friends who were basically of white appearance but wearing face masks were not getting the same level of harassment. But I also use a standing crutch, and visibly disabled women too who were wearing face masks were not of, but were basically white or white passing, were not reporting that kind of harassment either. And again, at the Royal Commission, there was talk about disabled women during the panic shopping being just shoved, physically pushed out of the way, aggressively trampled. And so it's but I'll let Ruth have the spotlight for a bit. But anyhow, but I do very much feel, I do feel like, because I do look a bit niqabi, especially the first face mask I had was black and I was wearing with a dark hoodie. It did look, as I said to my friend, I realized that I look like a media representation of the midlife jihadi bride here. So, and I also noticed that more conservative religious Muslims were showing me a level of friendliness that I wasn't used to seeing. So that's the upside. I was getting a lot of, hey, sister. Okay. So there was that.
Thanks, Shakira. Hi, everybody. Just want to acknowledge where I'm speaking from today. I'm on Bunwarong land at Western Port, and I have patchy internet, so hopefully I'll sound okay, but I'll keep an eye on the chat in case I fizzle out. Just really want to acknowledge any Aboriginal and First Nations people who are listening, and acknowledge this is land that's never been ceded, and I'm an uninvited guest on this land. I think this is a really, really important conversation, and I just really want to acknowledge all the people that have tuned in to listen. I see that there are old friends from Aotearoa, kia ora. Great to have you here, and it's a really special thing to be able to have this conversation. And I think, just building on Shakira's point, when you think about the people who are most marginalized from institutions and services, and somehow think about, from the US too, and think about, what does it mean to be inclusive, which kind of leads me to my point, the points that I want to make about intersectionality. And I know there's a few people that are listening that didn't come to the first one, so I just want to do a super fast recap, and just say there are 4 things that I think are important about intersectionality to me. And the first is just the refusal that there's a predetermined hierarchy of vulnerable groups. Second, a rejection of universality, and I want to return to that in a minute, that all women have the same experience, or people who identify as women, or all people of color are the same, you know, so it rejects that universal idea. Thirdly, that the risks and impacts are shaped by a web. And I think Judy spoke about this beautifully. You know, it's not additive, it's kind of the intersection of all these different aspects of our social identities that have an impact. And then all those kinds of identities are shaped by processes and structures of power. So, you know, we must think about capitalism, globalization, patriarchy, as Nyadol was talking about, racism, nationalism, xenophobia, and they create an interplay of kind of advantages and vulnerabilities. And I think that's really important. And so I wanted to talk about a different kind of violence, and Nyadol has talked about institutional violence in terms of platforms. Shakira has talked about, you know, ableist kind of mechanisms that prevent people from participating. And I guess I was thinking of the health sector because that's my background, and how all these isms are the kind of dominant discourses that we're all floating in, you know, that unless we are shaken in some way or interrupted, as Nyadol said in her example of becoming a parent and suddenly realizing what a disabling environment she was in, you know, and trying to get a train, they're embedded in our institutions, in our processes and our mechanisms, because there's a focus on often a singular access of identity. And my interest has been in the kind of violence of very ordinary and everyday processes that wouldn't actually be thought of as violent and discriminatory, because they're just how we do business, you know? And so what I'm interested in is, how do we figure out who they are centering? You know, who's that imagined user? And in a settler nation, you know, those parameters have been set by the colonizers. You know, we're not yet post-colonial. We're a white settler nation with structures of power that privilege a certain group. So I think that that's probably quite a good place to stop so other people can get a word in. But I just wanted to say those things as kind of framing the way that I think about intersectionality.
I was going to add to that, Ruth, because I think it's really great that you mentioned privilege into it, because we all have different levels of privilege. And I think what happens is, with privilege comes an accidental ignorance of the power and the level that you are on. So, you know, I think it was great if we're talking about examples. You know, it's something as simple as, let's just say, you know, you're at a work meeting and it's a women's work meeting. But then when you bring intersectionality of race, for example, perhaps, you know, a woman of color is less likely to be given more of a platform to speak, even though technically, you know, according to the women who white women, for example, would have thought that they would have provided a level playing ground. However, because coming from a society where it's not, it's more like, you know, it's in the back of your mind to have these sort of racist or homophobic or ableist views, without you realizing you're perhaps, you know, not giving that space to these women with these other intersectionalities. Not on purpose. And so it's not saying, you know, here are these women just doing these things, but without understanding your own privilege and the potential blind spots that come with that, means that you are participating unwillingly in discriminatory behavior.
Could I just also jump in there and kind of take on that topic about privilege? The best way it's been summarized by somebody else is that we all have the ability to oppress. And I think that's both, it can be a very confronting statement to say, because there are moments in which all of us experience a sense of powerlessness or just a sense of lack of control of the world. Say, how can I possibly be in a position to oppress somebody else? My life is already as it is, and probably objectively hard. But it took me a while to learn that I participate in a form of oppression by the means in which I came to this country as an immigrant who came in. I didn't come here through a process set up by Indigenous people. I came here through a process set up by a settler system that colonized and dispossessed a whole group of people of their land and diminished their way of life. And so what I stepped in wasn't a welcoming from the original people of this country. It was into a different setting. And I think that, and I bought into that system in that I was for a while an ambassador for Australia Day. I personally no longer support that. But as a person who came here, the way it was, the way I understood it was that it was an appreciation for the country that I had arrived in to engage in the participation of celebrating this day. But I had little knowledge that it was a day that was deeply offensive and hurtful to Indigenous people. It marked to them the beginning of a really long battle in which they continue to fight even today. But I had no appreciation of that. And another way in which I have seen my own privilege operate is the way in which, because people assume that as I am a Black person, that somehow I can speak on topic of racism that cover even the Indigenous people's perspective. And so what we become as settlers women without knowing is that we begin to erase Indigenous women and Indigenous people's voices if we're not careful. And what I've tried to learn from that process is to always insist whenever I'm invited into panels, whether it's media or not, whether they've been an extended invitation to a person of Indigenous background to speak on that. Because I think it's really wrong that when there's a topic and discussion about racism, that the first people that we go to are, you know, brown and Black women who are settlers and not Indigenous people. So I think that is some of the ways in which we can operate without even knowing, or sometimes even knowing it, because I know members of South Sudanese community who claim that there's no racism in Australia in a way, as a way of buying in to the system, the mainstream system, so that they are better accommodated for, you know, and so they are buying into a hierarchy, hoping that they will not be on the bottom. And so they want to say there's no discrimination in this country, there's no racism, because look at me, I came as a refugee and I'm making it. You know, so I think it's really important that when we talk about this issue of intersectionality and stuff, that we are able to go back and reflect at our own personal experiences. And what I hope we learn from this experience is not only just a sense of, okay, maybe I sort of mess up there, but to see how in the telling of our stories, we can begin to educate people within our own community about how to be better allies and lessen the impacts of intersectional violence on other people.
I think also we have to do this act of unlearning, Nyadol, you know, like my family migrated from Kenya to Nairobi, Kenya to Aotearoa, New Zealand, you know, and we didn't have the welcome that you're talking about. And we're taught, at least I was taught, that, you know, to be respectable and to do all the right things, to make good on all the sacrifices that my family had made. And I think that's the migrant story. And I think one of the things that has to happen is the unlearning that we have to do to kind of start to see our complicity in the erasure or oppression of others. And I think I just wanted to add a brief thought to what you said, Nyadol. Like for me, the first sign of learning around my own privilege is when I feel angry or anxious or have a funny feeling in my puku, in my tummy or in my heart, and I feel like I need to be defensive. That's usually a sign that there's a big learning to happen. So thank you for raising that issue of how privilege might shift in different positions and in different contexts, and we might be simultaneously oppressed and privileged in the one body.
One of my favorite stories was when it's almost like entering from a space of less privilege to a space of more privilege, was when friends of my Asian friends went from who are based in Australia went to Singapore, for example, where it's a predominantly Chinese society, and they're kind of the more privileged standing within that country, and just sort of experiencing that difference there was made them realize, oh wow, so this is how privilege feels like. It's kind of nice, you know, because everything seems to just work. And then coming back to Australia, it just kind of just gives that highlight in that way. So in many ways, and I think that just really highlights that privilege and standing changes in every setting, not just from country to country, but also from setting to setting, from your work setting to your home setting to your various community settings as well.
If I could come in with the Muslim experience after 9/11, because that was for Lebanese Muslims, and not just Muslims, people of Lebanese background had been, not to the extent I think of Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian migrants, but during the 90s, during the lead up to the 9/11 years, there'd been all this stuff about, you know, crime gangs and Cabramatta and you know, and drugs. And now all of a sudden it was about terrorism and national security. But because Lebanese Muslims had already been stigmatized in the 90s as sort of crime gangs, and so Muslims of South Asian background, which is mine, I will say, were their instinctive immediate post 9/11 reaction was to say, oh, but that's the Lebanese Muslims. You have to understand, we're not all the same. You know, we're the good ones, and we came here as skilled migrants, and they came in as refugees, and they're not so educated, and they were colonized by the French. We were colonized by the British. Listen to our accent. Sorry. And yeah, and you know, then, and also because the Sydney gang rapes, also called Sydney gang rapes, which happened around the same time as the 9/11 attacks, and where the trials for that dragged on for years, was also mostly Lebanese offenders in that case. But then there were some other very notorious gang rapes where the criminals where the offenders were Pakistani backgrounds. So the Pakistani pitch on, oh, it's the lamps, and that kind of finger pointing. Okay, but yeah, and I think that, I hope we don't navigate that issue as clumsily and as problematically as we did at that stage, but it still emerges and you still hear it, and even if it's said less publicly, but there's still a lot of it, you know, within community spaces. And yeah, anyhow. Not a lot of solidarity.
And that's the thing with discrimination, isn't it? I mean, you know, when they start having minority groups being pitted against each other, that's when they start to win. They being, you know, the non-minority, the majority, I suppose, and certainly that's, you know, been the case for a lot of migrant groups being anti. Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. Like, where did that come from? It makes no sense. You know, it must have come from some media, some kind of learnings where these migrant groups are picking up these level of racism that technically wouldn't have been there before. So it's just really having a deeper understanding that with intersectionality, we're able to break down and understand where our discrimination comes from, in order to try and continue to build communities together as opposed to tearing them apart.
Actually fascinated. I'm actually sorry.
No, go. You go.
I'm fascinated by that point, by the point that you mentioned about how communities are placed against each other. And I think even for, and it's interesting that tends to come from people who would actually say they do not understand what this intersectionality means. But I think that playing of community against each other is a very good understanding of how intersectionality work, but an inversion of it, so that you're using it to exploit the differences and to exploit the privileges, and say, okay, if you don't say something about these Sudanese gangs, you know, then the whole immigration system is going to be under threat, and people like you who come here and succeed might not be able to bring in your families. on these gangs are within your community and they might be able to attack, your homes or take your car and stuff. So I think it's a really smart way of actually understanding intersectionality and like turning it upside down for political use. So it is telling that, we live in a space where we have to somehow find a way of reclaiming it, because from my experience, when I've talked to people about the notion of intersectionality, you get a level of resistance in almost as if, a resistance as if you've accused them of something, of not understanding something, and also resistance in what do I have to give up, if I participate in this process. And there is a giving up, I think. There is a giving up sometimes of ideas and opinions and beliefs that you've had, and that can be painful, whether we're talking about political and social concepts like intersectionality, or we're talking about just deeply personal stuff. That transformative way of trying to grow as a person is always difficult. It feels like, sometimes pulling a tooth. But I think when I think of intersectionality, I think of it as a way of, a move from entitlement. We generally, when we talk about entitlement as a society, we see it as something slightly, it's been enhanced by capitalism and all that. But most people will think having a sense of entitlement is not a good thing. But I think intersectionality is the reverse of that. It's saying, from where I stand, how does the world around me look like? It's, imbuing your own sense of what you feel entitled to, the spaces you feel should cater for you, and understanding how they look like for different bodies, for different skin colors, for different genders, and appreciating that. What you're able to have, but also how you can help others in the process.
I think just linking into what you were saying and what Judy was saying, I was thinking about the issue of power, because to me, this is why the intersectionality conversation is important, because that strategy of creating competing others and cultivating a scarcity mentality means that fear is what drives things. So in terms of power, I think it's really interesting and useful to think about who's benefiting from the act of pitting groups against each other. What is being valued? What kind of people and positions and ways of being are being valued, and what is the effect and outcomes of this kind of thinking? Yeah.
I can give an example of who benefits from pitting groups against each other. This was back when they had the same-sex plebiscite, and there was a heavier campaign and more funding by the no vote towards migrant groups. And so what happened was, with a more funding and better campaigning for the no within migrant groups, is some migrant groups had a higher no vote. But of course, what happens immediately after the yes vote was won, what's the first thing that the media presents on? They present on, here are all the migrant groups that voted no. And it's another example of, how would you say, the people that benefit from that are the people who are able to say, okay, you see, these are the migrant people that were never on the Australian side who voted yes in the first place, which was never really the case. It was just a case of, they were able to put themselves within, I think, a group that was easier from their perspective to access and to change the minds to participate within the no vote. And so for me, that was a very clear example of pitting groups against each other to the detriment of the minority groups themselves. And who wins are the person who, or the community that wins are the community that want to see this division and want to see this drama unfold.
On the same-sex marriage issue, well, not so much the same-sex marriage, but on the issue of the sort of conservative religious to a very active same-sex marriage case, disabled people don't have a uniform view on this particular topic, which is euthanasia. But for many disability activists, that has been a very important topic. Victoria, as many of you will know, legalised, assisted dying legislation. I don't like that euphemism. To me, it's euthanasia. Anyhow, assisted suicide last year, and many disabled activists, including me, campaigned very hard against that, not on a right to life basis, but because it's inherently discriminatory to me and to others, that it's saying that some types of lives are so not worth living that we should help people to end them, while at others who express the desire to end their lives, it would be a medical professional's job to talk them out of that. But without going into the contours of that particular debate, of course you can imagine that conservative religious groups were keen to back us to the hilt on that one. And I was uncomfortable and taken aback to see, and particularly given that on the Muslim issue, of course, they're like not exactly friends, to have these conservative Christians suddenly wanting to be my bestie because I have articles I published on this topic. And I really was, I navigated it by just evading it, basically. But it didn't serve our interests, I don't think, because then it allowed that to be represented. And Andrew Denton, who was very prominent in support of the euthanasia debate, kept saying, well, if you dig deeply enough, you'll always find that it's always the conservative Christians who are behind it. Even if they say it's disability rights, it's not, it's the Catholic Church. Okay, no, it's not. They've jumped on board our campaign. We didn't invite them here. But anyhow, sorry, I'm not quite sure how intersectionality fits into that, but it was the mention of conservative religious organizations and the way that can, let's just say ructions that can cause when they're harnessed to other identities.
Thank you, Shakira. I really like this discussion, how this discussion has, we've started talking about privilege, and there is a question from someone in the attendees about privilege that I think is quite well fitting in where we are with this discussion. So I'll just take it now, but we'll get to more questions later. So it's from Hala Nasr. I'm interested in how the very neoliberal racist structures we are trying to dismantle seem to have infiltrated discussion of privilege and power. For example, individuals recognizing privilege and thinking that they have done their job. What do the panelists think? Who would like to respond to that?
I think that oppressed language is always a tool of first, I think it's always a tool of taking the message and then narrowing it down to something appropriate for the capitalist system in the first place, or for the political interest or the particular interest of that organization. And so you see now, even with racism, how the language is used, but really what is really concerned is, racism against, white people and white men. And all of a sudden, the language that was developed by those who were oppressed, is then utilized. And what I found both concerning and also just fascinating as just observing the world around me was the commercialization of the language that was coming out during the Black Lives Movement. All of a sudden, these major organizations, the big organizations, were issuing statements about Black Lives matters. I think that's irrelevant because, that statement would be made redundant if you are actually practicing this concept that Black Lives matters. If it's reflected in your leadership appointments, it's reflected in your employment practices, if it's reflected in your policy positions about how you deal with discrimination when it comes when it happens. What this, I think, exposes is either first a very shallow understanding, you know, some people might have good intention, but they really have shallow understanding of what the structural changes would look like. And I think at its most intelligent in a bad way, it's a very useful way of ensuring that actions do not progress ahead, because all you have to really do is, you know, stick up something on Twitter, say Black Lives Matters or Disabilities Life Matters or something like that, and then you're sort of like you've done doing your performance towards that very important issue. And it's also not something that you see, I'll have to say, or I don't think it's something that you see only in the right. I think sometimes you see it operate even within what is left or center left. And you see it in really, really glamorous policy statements, really, really glamorous reports, but still, you know, a good example is SBS. You know, his whole leadership structure was sort of predominantly white. And this was supposed to be a thing set up really to diversify the Australian media landscape that is supposed to be supposed to be representative of us. Now, the clear example is not that these oil companies are necessarily right, but it was blowing up an indigenous structure, or I think it was a cave or something that had significant indigenous people.
And she was getting to the good part too. Oh no.
Would one of you like to jump in on that point while we wait for Nyadol to connect back?
I think there's time for change right now, and perhaps thinking about the context of COVID and Black Lives Matter, we've begun seeing the ways in which the impacts of COVID have both been racialized. We've needed to have a gender lens, a sexuality. We've needed to have all the lenses of all the social categories, because what we've learned is that the pandemic finds the fault lines or the fracture lines, and has devastating consequences for all of us. And I guess that's what I was reflecting on when Nyadol was talking. I was thinking about how do we do this very, very strange thing, which is to somehow, imagine and understand these different identities all at the same time. You know, how do we think about all these differences at once? Because they affect who we think we are. This is what Carol de Cruz says, who others think we are, and what kind of life chances we acquire based on these markers of difference. So, like for me, there's something about the confluence of COVID and Black Lives Matter that has made people who were never in a position to really think about these things. And I'm concerned about why we have to experience something before we can care about it. You know, like, how do we create the circumstances under which we can think about what these things might mean for everybody? And I guess what I'm saying is, do we have to be temporarily disabled to understand disability? Do we need to see a washed up little boy on the beach like we did a few years ago to care about refugee children, refugee background children? Can we use the idea of intersectionality and this web of influences to somehow think about how one little tension on a web, and I'm thinking about a spider and a spider web here, but one little pull on a tiny part of the web actually has an impact on all of the web. And if I think about that as myself, who's not really an individual, I'm part of families and communities, but everyone that's part of my web and the bigger web, not just the virtual web, but our web of connections. That was a bit rambly, sorry.
Nyadol, did you want to pick up where you left off? Sorry,
No, that I was trying to explain how you know, the co-opting of the victim's language can be used as a way of narrowing the debate, or indeed extinguishing the debate itself, by either projecting an idea that we've done something, so it's settled, or in fact that those people have seen the whole problem wrong. What is the problem is not racism, is reverse racism, for example. But I think that tells us that when it comes to this, well, maybe I shouldn't say tell us, but I say that to me, when I think about the progress that we're trying to achieve by understanding the intersection of violence and discrimination and oppression, is that this is a really long-term project. In no small way, some of it is supposed to be technically revolutionary. We're trying to change the very systems that we have in place that have assumed, whether intentionally or not, a structure or a hierarchy of people, and where we all fall that, and how we fall out of those spaces. So I think it also requires a level from us of patience. Not patience toward oppression, but patience to understanding that the achievements are not necessarily going to come overnight. And sometimes you see the exhaustion from say, allies, when they make mistakes in their interaction or their support, and they're blamed. They think this is the kind of thing that make people not want to support you. You know, that's the statement that comes out in frustration. I'm trying my best to be engaged in being an ally, and yes, I'm failing, but you know, your reaction is making me want to give up in supporting you. And I think that come from an exhaustion of not understanding that this is a long-term project. This is a long-term investment in trying to create a more positive world. But it's also challenging, even I think, for those who are experiencing oppression, because when you're in a position of disadvantage, as an Indigenous person or a person of disability, you are tired of waiting. You know, I think James Baldwin summarized it really nicely in a quote where he say, you know, how long should I wait for your progress? You know, but I think that, and this is where I have in my experience a level of conflict, personal in some ways, in how do you engage with somebody who wants to be an ally, but is struggling in that process, because it's a learning process. It's not, you know, people don't arrive at allyship as complete, you know, well-knowing and stuff. And sometimes I struggle with the reaction I see, which can be very, very, very damaging to the other person, even as they try to be allies and support. Because when they fail, the reaction is, you failed us again after going through so much oppression, we can now not rely on your allyship. And I think that is a room for us to define what it is. Where is the space for learning for the allies? Because if silence is being complicit, and speaking up is not perfect, where does that leave those who want to be allies? If teaching them is exhausting for us, they have to go and do their own work, but in the process of doing their own work, they don't do it well, and we blame them, where is our extension of how far can we educate without exhausting ourselves? And so I think this is where, for me, I really, really struggle, because I think sometimes the concept of wokeness, if we are to accept that, you know, that we want to participate in helping others change and helping ourselves change, then wokeness cannot be performative. And inherently, the very act of people engaging in wanting to change processes and systems is an act of changing themselves, and that comes with them being able to make errors. Where is the space for allies to make errors? You know, I'm really interested in that, because I think it's still a very contentious place, particularly if you consider yourself to be in the center left. And I think sometimes we, you know, even the progressive, cost ourselves long-term allies in the process of short-term fighting without real gains.
I think also, Nyadol, you said that so beautifully. I think part of the problem, I think, is that everything is so accelerated. And you know, when we first started going online, returning to the idea of the virtual, it sort of felt like there was a space where you could have this asynchronous kind of learning, where there'd be an opportunity to read something. You know, I remember being so excited when I got an email, but like, oh, you know, and writing something and then waiting to hear someone respond, which would sometimes be hours, maybe days, but it was so exciting because there was this feedback mechanism. And then it's become highly accelerated. So the space to just sit with discomfort, the chance to make a mistake is no longer available to us. So you know, you might misgender someone accidentally, you might use the wrong word, and then before you know it, you're a pariah. And I think, you know, how do we take people along with us in our journey, but also let us, I mean, in terms of allies, encourage them to let us take a lead, because you
could I suggest that forgiveness is important here, and that maybe allies could perhaps accept that I'm going to speak again through the disability lens, because we're often in a lot of physical pain, you know. Don't expect us not to be short-tempered when we're, you know, physically hurting all over, when we've made the physical effort to be there and to be talking, and actually we're in the most, you know, and actually I'm not feeling so great today myself, you know, but here we are. Don't expect us to always be endlessly patient. So expect that if you fuck up, and excuse language and all, we're going to get sweary, we're going to get angry, we're going to lose our temper at you. But that doesn't mean that we never want to speak to you again. But also don't dismiss it as she was just having a bad day. Take what we say and think about it and consider what it is that might have provoked that reaction. But also know that, you know, that we're not, or well, sometimes it does happen, I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but we, the people, as in the whoever it is that's lost their temper, that we can be friends again tomorrow, and that friends and allies ought to be able to have those conversations, and allies, you know, shouldn't retreat wounded and nurse that hurt and not come back and say, okay, let's start again. And yeah.
I might have not made that point clear, but I absolutely agree with you. And I think that's the point I was trying to make when I said, you know, sometimes it's also not useful when the reaction of the allies are, well, I try my best, you guys are just trying to, you know, attack us, not giving us room to grow. And then, you know, this is why it's hard to support the cause. The cause has to be a personal commitment for each of us, you know, because either it's aligned with the kind of the way we want the world to be fairer for everybody else. And so even an angry reaction from somebody else, to me, is not a justification for giving up on the cause. The cause still remain an important cause, even if your interaction with somebody had not been ideal. So no, I absolutely agree with you, Dr. Shakira. I think you know, and I think there's a huge punch to what you said.
And not forgetting, at the end of the day, if an ally is thinking, well, I've done my bit and it feels like that's all, I mean, and then that's it, I feel like I can't do it anymore. Perhaps, you know, it just calls for a bit of self-reflection of where is this coming from? Where is this sense of allyship coming from? Is it coming from a sense where you want to provide this allyship in return? And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with this, in return for, you know, feeling better about yourself. Then that potentially is a weaker foundation for which your allyship stands. You know, because at the end of the day, you know, people are people, and that's one of the things and that's one of the beautiful things that we should be embracing, diversity. You know, we all have good days, we all have bad days, we all react differently. And if your allyship is fragile in that, if someone has a bad day and it shakes your foundation of allyship, then that's something to really self-reflect on what foundations your allyship are based on, and to potentially change that into stronger foundations. Stronger foundation being not related to your own sense of achievement or sense of gratification, and into something where it's, hey, this is actually a thing. Tear me down 10 times and I'll stand up 11 times because I believe in this cause. So for me, it's that level of importance of self-reflection from the allies' perspective, but also understand from us who benefit from the allyship, also, giving them that space of self-reflection and growth as well.
Thank you. I might just start taking more questions. I'm mindful of the time. We have 25 minutes to the end, and there are a lot of questions coming in, which are all really, really relevant and important. I think the discussion that we just had about privilege and the shift from acknowledging privilege to taking responsibility addresses some of the questions in there already. So, for example, there was a question about how do we have the difficult conversations about power, privilege, and giving up what we have. And I think we have already addressed that point to some extent in the discussion. And there was a question about how migrants who have a certain level of privilege and coming to the Western countries and using that privilege, but also raising their voice against the racism and against injustices that are committed towards them as migrants, still go back to their home countries and continue to live privileged lives and benefit from the oppression and underrepresentation of other people. So and I think that's also the same sort of question about, while we may become aware of certain issues because we are in an underprivileged position in a certain context, and then we go back and we are not able to apply that lens and flip it and see where we are privileged, and we might be perpetuating inequalities. So I think those points have been addressed to some extent. There was
I also think Nyadol spoke about this beautifully when asking the question, am I the right person to be in this conversation? Should there be other people that are not in this conversation? And those I think are really important questions. And I think for many of us who've tried hard to get a platform, that can be really kind of challenging when we get offered one, to then say, I really want to be able to speak because I never get to speak, but there are other people who are better than me. So I think this is a big learning, and it also points to the structural, which is, why is the table built, that we're being invited to sit at? Why is the table so small? Why can't more of us be at this table?
Yeah.
There's a point you made there about how some of us here come and benefit from the system here, but also participate in oppression back home. I think that's, or systems of oppression from our original from. And I think that goes to the point of how insidious privilege is. You don't see it most of the time. You don't see how it, and then of course that is layered with the psychological nature of all of us to always, in some ways, look away from those things that point a bad finger at us. We tend to see what other people do wrong, and it's an interesting thing. I mean, I'll give you all an example. The African gang issue came after the South Sudanese Civil War, and the South Sudanese Civil War was a very divisive war. It was fought along very tribal lines. And I remember some of the people that were anti-African gang were quite actively engaged in the political conversation that were happening in South Sudan in a very oppressive way, clearly very oppressive way, taking what it's actually to me the very opposite. And I couldn't reconcile the two. I was thinking, well, if you can see oppression in one because you're a victim of oppression here, how could you not see that it's the same dynamic, just different players? different players back home. So I find that interesting as an observer, because I tend to sit around and just observe the things happening and supposed to think about it. But it's a legitimate issue, and that might be. I mean, I laugh, but if you take away the laugh, this is serious, because some of the places people are being killed. You know, in South Sudan, journalists are murdered for speaking up. People are in prison indefinitely for standing up and speaking up about a government. We've barely had any elections back in South Sudan, so it's real things. But you can see people living here enjoying the democratic systems here, supporting these regimes that are doing exactly the opposite of what they are doing. And to me, it's a really difficult thing to reconcile, to reconcile how anyone can sort of do that. But, you know, I think when you are the oppressor, it's harder to see that you are the oppressor, because you have systems that justify why things are the way they are.
Yep. And that's beautifully answered. I think the next question that I would like to take is from Jamal Hakim. Often a dilemma in intersectionality is the attack from both advocates and detractors is a question on where does intersectionality stop, and questions around how many voices need to be heard when delivering something in practical terms. What do you think leaders working to build intersectionality over time practically do to start the process and simultaneously address negative rhetoric that can be otherwise demotivating in building the space?
I was going to say, I'm a visual person. I'm going to have to see that question.
I think it's essentially the similar sort of, I guess what the person is trying to ask is how, when this argument is made that intersectionality is too complex when we have to do it in practice, and how is it possible to hear voices on intersections of all sorts of margins and all sorts of discriminatory systems when decision makers and policy makers and people who are trying to implement something in practice are trying to simplify things. They don't want complexity. They don't want to deal with too many voices. And is there a practical advice you would like to give in that sort of situation where we can deal with complexity without having to reduce it or oversimplify it?
I think that, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about for the last couple of years is that the problems defined as organizations or institutions not being representative of the community. And so then of communities, I should say. And then there's been a very additive approach to that, which is like, oh, we'll just add this person who has these attributes that are missing from the organization and stir. But the problem is the structure and the purpose and the function and the way of doing things remains the same. And I remember someone from Black Lives Matter, whose name has escaped me, but I'll remember as soon as this finishes, saying presence doesn't equal power. So I also think it's about critical mass. I think it's about worldviews and different ways of thinking and being, and how much space there is for them. I'm sure I've probably gone off track because this Zoom thing is so kind of, you know, it's so much harder to kind of train your thoughts. But yeah, that's what I was thinking when you're talking.
I think at the end of the day, just probably Virginia just sort of mentioned, how can you have simple solutions to complex issues? Not that intersectionality is that complex. People who embody it can tell you exactly what it is. Problem is that intersectionality is seen as additive rather than overlapping systems of oppression. And I totally agree with that. I think unfortunately, you know, some of the foundations are built on is, okay, now exactly like Ruth mentioned, okay, now we have to consider disability. Let's add this checklist to it. Now we need to consider LGBTIQ. Let's add this person. Let's add this checklist. And it's not an additive process. When we look at it from an additive perspective, of course it becomes exhausting, because then it looks like it's another thing to add on. But having an intersectional lens is understanding that web that Ruth was talking about, and providing access to opportunities across all levels, not necessarily just showing you have this checklist done. I think, I hope that answers the question in that sense, how to simplify it in some ways. And by adding a list is, or you know, ticking something off a box is not the simple way of fixing
I
the
tick
issue.
a lot of boxes.
Yeah.
I get put on a lot of lists.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody give me a goddamn job already.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that the question we shouldn't be asking how many voices do we need to hear. We should be asking how do we hear, how do we listen, rather than asking how many voices do we need to listen to. So it's really about the approach and the process, rather than counting and adding the number of voices that we wanting to hear.
So I think at the end of the day, if we're talking about, you know, with my analogy of a seat at the table, it's, we don't want everyone to have a seat at that table, but everyone wants to know that if they wanted that seat, they have the same opportunity to apply to be on that seat. And the barriers that everyone has to access that seat is the same. There is no more barriers for a particular person over another. So I think that's probably the way that I would look at it.
So some of the other questions are asking about self-interest, capitalism that makes people want move upwardly, do good things for themselves and their families. So essentially the things we have mentioned already: self-interest and advancement, the overarching capitalism that people are buying into, and how do we deal with how do we do intersectionality when people are essentially self-interested, or there is the inherent human nature, regardless of one's social or political background or status, to be self-interested.
I mean, I don't think it is possible for any human being to utterly somehow disconnect from all the upbringing, you know, in a family, in a society, in a political system, in an economic system. I think it's one of those things that I think it's a learning until death. You know, it's a shedding of oneself and I suppose recreating oneself. I have changed a lot. You know, a lot of what is politic is personal. I came from, and when I go back to my experiences, I hope it doesn't sound very narcissistic, but I find it more grounding when you can give examples, and also less blaming and finger pointing, because it's able to demonstrate my own failures. So I come from a very socially conservative background. You know, South Sudanese are very socially conservatives. You know, we were the kind of people that would have exactly voted against marriage equality. In fact, I think when I told my mom that I supported marriage equality, her words to me, sorry, I was trying not to identify her, I was supposed to say a relative. Her words to me was, I wish God never gives you any form of power, you know, because she was brought up as a very religious woman from a young age. That's her world, that's the world I grew up in. And so my first formed opinions, you know, about a different, not a different, but another sexuality was completely compressed. I only knew and grew up in a society that had language for only marriage in a very singular way. that has ideas of who can participate in it in a very singular way. I did not grow up with any other language, any other concepts. So when I stepped to this country, it was a process of shedding and a process of giving up an entire way of how I was brought up. And so I think that all of us comes into this space of intersectionality, come into the space of discussing political opinions, all these things that we have to engage with, we also bring our own personal luggage into it. And that complicates things. And I suppose the only way I can try and give it a positive form is that sometimes we do need to plant trees that we will never enjoy the shade. That is the kindness of humanity. We do things, not because they're charitable, not because we benefit from them, but because to a large degree, it brings a much more significant change and worth to somebody else's life, and probably maybe just inconvenience you.
I think your point also about that intergenerational impact's really powerful, because I think when we're talking about being diasporic, there's something about migration that is a break in culture that you're talking about, Nyadol, you know, that, you know, it's a little bit like studying, you know, all of us have done some study. It's like, you don't do it to remain the same person. And with migration, you don't do it to remain the same, you know, I mean, I know sometimes it's forced, unwanted, because of all kinds of constraints and pressures. But I think that the next generation are put in a position where they do have an opportunity to kind of evaluate the values of their heritage plus the new values. And when I hear my parents correcting people who are saying shit, you know, I feel really proud, because it's like, oh, they listen to all my lectures, you know. And when I've had fights with my parents and my sister says, didn't you want her to get a good education in another country? Didn't you want her to have a PhD? Well, this is why she's so bolshy, because this is what you wanted, and this is the other side of it.
I have to run because I have to go and pick up my children. Intersectionality there, Mom. But I'm hoping that all of you stay well. I'm really sorry for the run off.
Thank you so much, Nyadol. Thank you for joining us. And it has been an incredible discussion, and all of your contributions are amazing. Thank you so much. Shakira, there is a question for you, because you mentioned the tone policing, and somebody is asking, it's an anonymous attendee, they're asking how, as women of color, do you deal with people who tone police and minimize your responses?
Sorry, I didn't catch the beginning of that. I got the bit about tone policing.
How, as a woman of color, do you deal with people who tone police and minimize your responses?
I'm not sure if this quite answers the question. I struggle with some very ableist language that I hear from within the anti-racist movement sometimes, well, actually, often in fact. And because I know that it's a new concept for people, well, I see people using the word blind as a metaphor actually in the tweets about this. I don't know whether one of the panelists used it. I mean, it was being literally crippled that made me realize that actually talking about a policy or an initiative as being crippling, or debt as being crippling, so, okay, I suddenly see that metaphor in a new way. So I'm still learning myself, and I try to acknowledge that when pointing out to other people that maybe, you know, maybe there's a word that one could use other than blind, you know, and different to, or whatever it is that you're trying to say that instead. And I hope that by acknowledging that it's, you know, that it's a learning process for me too, for all of us, that might help. But that still doesn't stop people from sometimes responding extremely aggressively if they're used to always feeling like they're in the right. Like I had some extremely, you know, and aggressively defensive conversations with some experienced and high profile anti-racist activists and scholars over whether it was okay to use the R word, which I'll let you Google what the R word is if you don't, you collectively, anybody who doesn't already know. And that, you know, if you wouldn't use the N word, then you really shouldn't use the R word. And they were so, like, whether there's a hierarchy, whether the R word is as bad as, or not quite as bad as, or nearly as bad as, or whatever, than the N word, that isn't the point. It doesn't matter whether it's only half as offensive as the N word. It's offensive. Don't say it. Don't use it. You know, I have a neurological disease. And if we talk about privilege, on the one hand, I'm very defensive in saying that actually it's not affecting my cognition. I'm still getting peer-reviewed journal articles published. My book got a fabulous review in the Times Literary Supplement. Go Google me. Blah. Sorry. I get an income. Bragging is the only gratification I'm getting from my academic output at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. But anyways, but I'm aware that in defending myself in that way, that's also an implicit put down of people who do have cognitive impairments and who in fact might have the kind of emotional intelligence that I myself often lack, and that the people who I might be in conversation with often lack as well. So I shouldn't tone police in a way that not only demeans the person that I'm speaking to, but also demeans a whole other cohort of people that we're just shrugging off as irrelevant. People, you know, like if you call somebody stupid, you're not just putting down the person you're speaking to who probably isn't in IQ terms, you're also putting down people with cognitive impairments, but who still make a valuable contribution and who still, as I say, can have an extremely high level of emotional intelligence and insight and know when you're insulting them too. Sorry, I realize that was a very roundabout response, but...
No, that's perfectly fine, and it touches on a really important issue around language more broadly as well. Because tone policing does not necessarily is not necessarily restricted to the way you're talking, but also the use of the certain words and all of that as well. So I think it's really relevant. We have 2 minutes to go, and Ruth, would you mind if I use the quote you shared with us yesterday to end this session, because it was just so beautiful and moving. I have been reading it over and over again since yesterday, and I think it's a beautiful note to end the session on.
Please do.
Thank you. So Ruth shared this quote with us yesterday, and it says, "He could not see that I could be both. The body in front of him was already inscribed within the gendered social relations of the colonial sandwich. I could not just be. I had to name an identity. No matter what this naming rendered invisible, all the other identities of gender, caste, religion, linguistic group, generation, and so on." So we have talked about compartmentalization and forced compartmentalization of identities that are socially constructed and socially ascribed by the power structures that exist, and that the sole purpose of constructing those identities also to keep people in their place, and then asking people to identify themselves with something and be one thing and not the other, or be something that they recognize and not something that they do not recognize, is really the problem that intersectionality aims to address and that we're trying to get to. And we'll continue these conversations. Please join us for the next webinar on 3rd of September, where we talk a bit more about the issue of violence more specifically, and how can we talk about violence in multicultural communities without labeling it or otherizing the communities as complex forms of violence, which is a predominant or dominant way of talking about violence in certain communities these days. Thank you very much to everyone who joined and stayed throughout the whole panel discussion. It is really incredible to see so much interest in this topic and such vibrant discussions. We couldn't get to all the questions, but thank you for everyone who has sent in their comments and questions throughout, and we'll put the recording of this webinar up soon. Thank you. Have a nice evening.